Moderating for you today is myself. My name's Monica Gate.
And my name is Trudee Ngkaion.
And we are here from Theatre by the Bay's Indie Producer Co-op. So we're all the way from the West Coast joining this production with you today. On our
Thank you.
Stop! On our lovely panel today, we have Anne Dublin, who is the author of Bobbie Rosenfeld, the Olympian who could do everything. Yep. Amazing book, and a book that has been so helpful in the research of this production. We have Rochelle Thompson, our fantastic, amazing blood connection to Bobbie Rosenfeld. We have Bruce Kidd, our lovely 1964 Olympic runner, who is wearing running shoes today just to prove it. And at the end there, we have our wonderful playwright, Trudee Romanek.
Great. So before we open it up to the audience for some questions, we're just going to get the conversation started here with some questions for our lovely panelists. So let's start here with Anne. We're curious, what made you want to write the book? And what has been the response to that, the work that you've created?
Thanks, Teddy. Well, I guess I have to go back to my childhood a little bit because being an immigrant kid myself, as soon as I was able to go to the library on my own, I went to the Witchwood branch of the Toronto Public Library in Toronto, and there was a shelf of books, biographies, and they all had orange covers. And I remember reading every single biography on that shelf. I was very disappointed when they ran out of those orange biographies. So I guess I was always fascinated by the lives of other people and the challenges that they went through and how they overcame those challenges. So fast forward a few decades, and I had written a historical novel already, but I somehow wanted to write a biography, and I was searching around for someone to write about, and then just by chance I saw a documentary on CBC about Bobbie Rosenfeld. It was called Bobbie Rosenfeld, the Natural Athlete, and so my interest, I started getting interested. Who is this person? I've never heard of her. And I did some research, found out there was an online exhibit about her in this wonderful website called the Jewish Women's Archive. And, well, I was hooked. I had to write about her. And what's more, no one else had written about her. And I thought, like, what's going on? She's such an important person in Toronto, Canada, the world even. So I thought, I have to write her story. And that's basically where it came from. Thanks to Margie Wolf at Second Story Press, the book was published. In 2004, I was telling Bruce and the other eminent panelists here, like, I can't believe it was 20 years ago that I wrote the book and that it was published. But the wonderful thing about biographies is usually they don't go out of date, especially if the person has passed away. So what's the response? Second question, right? Well, I was honored with the a Canadian Jewish Book Award for this book the year after it was published, as well as some other nominations and awards. But you know, that wasn't the most important thing to me. To me is that people could read Bobbie's story and learn about the enormous challenges that she faced. Trudee beautifully expressed some of those in the play, especially about anti-Semitism, but even more about being a woman in athletics in those days, especially after the Olympics. about her suffering from arthritis and what happened then. And then taking her love of sports and channeling it so that she could write about sports for 20 years for the Globe and Mail. So that's a long answer to a short question, and I want other people to talk, but thanks for asking that.
Thank you. It's been such an instrumental work, I'm sure, in Trudee's process as well, and in getting Bobbie's story out there, so thank you for writing it.
Rochelle, I'm eyeballing you because I'm about to ask you a question. What has it been like trying to share Bobbie's story and the response that you've gotten from people from that?
It's actually been quite a journey and quite incredible. But I just also want to say that I am Gertie's daughter, so I'm the daughter of the first Rosenfeld who was born in Barrie, and very proud of that. And also Ethel, who is Bobbie's youngest sister, her grandson and his son and nephew are both here today, so I really wanted to honor that we've got a chunk of family. I grew up with the personal Bobbie, and I didn't know the professional Bobbie until I came into that picture when I was 12. But what I did know is that in my family, we really felt that whenever there was an injustice, the family had to do something about it. And if there was an injustice, that was partly Bobbie led that, and it just was all of us. And I think because there really was an ongoing controversy about not the final result of the 100 meters, but the issue of lack of support for standing up for somebody, whether they won the protest or not, but at least allowing them to have a voice. From that point, Bobbie did not shy away from having a voice, but the rest of us always felt that we had to make sure that Bobbie's voice was heard. And that's been really a long-term thing for me that I didn't even realize. I want to say something about the process of this play, though, because what I feel about Bobbie and the play is that something magic has happened. I feel that it's like there's this little closed box and somebody opened it and poured a whole bunch of water in and Bobbie sprung out. And it's the most amazing thing. And when Olivia is talking about Bobbie as Bobbie, it really feels like Bobbie. And I think that's just such an incredible, special gift. The other thing, too, in terms of all the funny things, is I got to meet Trudee, learned more about family members that I didn't even know, have a chance to pass on Bobbie's story to the next generation. And there were a couple of weird things that we discovered in terms of, so just finishing up on the magic. So Trudee and I have been talking, and we found family history, and every now and then we would meet, and we met to go for a walk, and I thought, gee, I have these candlesticks, I should bring them, maybe she'd like to see them. And I brought the candlesticks. I didn't know that the candlesticks were already a part of the play. And Trudee didn't know that the ones I brought were very much the ones that are downstairs, which actually were my grandmother's candlesticks, that they actually looked very much like the ones that they had in the play. You didn't know they existed. I know. I just figured, well, I might as well bring these. She might like to see them, because I just kept bringing things for her to see. And then I phoned her one day because I was cleaning up at my place in north of Bracebridge. And I looked around and I found something. See, when Ethel moved in the 80s, she had a yard sale. And she thought, okay, let me get rid of all sorts of stuff. And she had this framed portrait of Morris that she wanted to put out in the yard sale because she figured somebody would pay for the frame. And I thought that was outrageous. So I said to her, you cannot sell Uncle Morris. So I took him. And I didn't know what to do with him because Morris died when I was 3. I really don't have any memory of him, but you can't sell Uncle Morris. So he ended up in a basement of 3 different places I lived, and then I totally forgot about them. And comes the play, and I'm cleaning up, and who do I find but Uncle Morris? And because of that, he's downstairs too.
Well, Trudee, that's the name of the next show we'd like you to write, is You Can't Sell Uncle Morris.
All right, so Bruce, throughout the play, we see Bobbie struggle to represent herself and her culture and Canada as an athlete, and to really stand for something. And you, as a former Olympian, you've experienced what it means to represent this country. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that experience and that drive that really, what's the Olympic difference, I guess, and what was your experience doing the Olympics?
Well, the Olympic movement doesn't always give all competitors that confidence, but Bobbie had it. And from all accounts, she had a command, a confidence, a determination to represent girls and women, a determination to give girls and women a chance to excel in the ways that they want, and a determination to represent Jewish people in a very proud way. I only met her once as a young athlete. I'm pleased to say, I'm honored to tell you that she presented me with an award. She also gave me a hard time because she phoned my mother and asked my mother what other benefits the Amateur Athletic Union could give me as part of this award. And my mother said, well, like you, Miss Rosenfeld, he wants to be a writer. It would be terrific if you gave him a portable typewriter. And Bobbie, who is a staunch defender of strict amateurism, was horrified. And she threatened to have me and my mother expelled from amateur sport until we backed off. And my parents had to buy me a portable typewriter and wave the receipt around to show that it had nothing to do with her. That was an interesting episode, but she was strict and consistent, and I would say and fair too. She was such a hero. I knew girls and women of the 1950s who would run across the street or a football field to get her autograph. She was a giant of Canadian sport, and I'd always assumed that she had the confidence of a giant in every competition or every situation she was in. I talked at length to people who knew her well in the course of my own writing about her and the women's sports movement of the 20s and 30s. And everybody that I talked to told you the same stories about her tremendous confidence, her generosity to teammates and even competitors, and her command. It may well be that she was nervous before those races, but she gave everyone else confidence. I think the Jean Thompson story, which I heard many times as a young athlete, is an example of that. Everybody on that team felt that she could have won that race, that 800-meter race, and she stood back and helped her young competitor finish rather than go. For her, it was no big deal. I can do this, but my job is to help my teammate. And she was that way in everything she did. I've had men tell, she was an Olympic champion in track. She was a tennis champion in Toronto. She was the star of the National Basketball Championships in the 1920s. She was the headliner at Sunnyside Stadium when she played softball for the teams that you mentioned. And people forget, when she played softball, they attracted the biggest sporting crowds of the day in Toronto. I've actually looked at the attendance records in the Toronto Historic Commission, which at the time owned and operated Sunnyside Stadium for women's softball and the Toronto Maple Leaf Stadium at the foot of Bathurst Street for the professional AAA baseball team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And there were some seasons when Bobbie was playing that more Torontonians paid to watch the women play softball than paid to watch the men play professional baseball. She was that kind of a star, and she brought confidence to all of those games. I've had a contemporary of hers tell me that she was such a hockey player that she could have played in the NHL and made a team in that era. She was so good. And it was all with this sense of command, this sense of confidence that she came to that. And then, of course, and I thought you captured it so well, she wanted to transition into writing because she wanted to say with her own voice why sport was important and why people should be treated as they are, full stop, period. On her Jewishness, she was the first prominent Canadian sports person to call for a boycott of Nazi Germany in 1934 and 35, when Canadians were debating whether to send a team to the 1936 in Berlin. She may have had private doubts, but boy, when she was in the public realm, she did everything with confidence and command.
Thank you so much.
Bruce, I'm going to disillusion you a little bit. Bobbie cheated on something. She had the column, and maybe she wasn't supposed to do this, or maybe she just didn't care. But at that time, I was swimming and I was racing as a swimmer. And every day when I had a race, there would be a line in her column that said, "Good luck, Rochelle."
And you know, if I can just add one more sort of anecdote, secondhand. She, according to Helen Gurney, who was an outstanding basketball player in her youth, and then an outstanding physical educator, and became the head of women's physical education for all of Ontario, and then became a historian of women's sport. And maybe you published one of her books. I'm not sure.
No, but I think we did an article.
But she told me that I thought you presented Alexandrine Gibb very well. And Alex was 10, 20 years older than Bobbie, and the two of them were like this in leading women's sport, in creating women's sporting organizations, in going into committee rooms and fighting for women's sport. And Helen told me that Alex helped her, I'm not sure what's the easiest way to say this, become presentable to the anti-Semitic white establishment of Toronto, to get support for women's sport principally, and overcome the anti-Semitism that you described. Helen described how Alex helped her overcome the traces of her Russian accent, probably Russian Yiddish accent. Helen told me how Alex, when they decided on this strategy, that Bobbie would be a representative for women's sport in Canada, Alex groomed her in dress, groomed her in comportment, groomed her in all of the things that would get her accepted in the Toronto establishment in order to be the advocate and the role model that both of them wanted her to be. Incredible, incredible.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for the stories, and it's really a testament to what a force Bobbie was, that generations later, 40 years later, that you still have personal stories about her, and she still commanded the respect of you and your teammates during your time as well. Thank you.
Now, Trudee. Obviously, your play has had such an overwhelmingly positive response, but we're wondering if you could speak a little bit to your process of the research and maybe things that you were really surprised by, things that you found challenging in it as well.
Sure. I think probably the first thing I did was read Anne's book because it's just a wealth of information, and so really great cataloging of the context within which Bobbie had these successes, as well as the chronology of those successes. So really essential reading for me, for sure. I did a lot of research using the historical newspapers from Barrie, the local newspapers, the Barrie Examiner and the Northern Advance. Because part of the problem is I wanted to write about, as Rochelle says, I wanted to write about Fanny rather than Bobbie. I wanted to write about the years that she was in Barrie and how those might have impacted her in the career that followed. And so there's not a lot written about a person who's not yet famous. So it takes some digging, and I can tell you whether she passed each grade of school with honors or first class honors. I have a whole long list. I can tell you that Morris played the advisor of the Caterpillar in a production of Alice in Wonderland at school, and that Fanny played a mom in some play that had a son who had a cat. That's all I know, because a newspaper person remembered playing the son with the cat because he had a cat. So I could only find these little dribs and drabs of things. But I did find out that Velvel did come to Barrie before Max and Sarah came to Barrie and helped them settle here. I found that there was a Rosenfeld in Barrie before that who may well have been an older brother of both Max and Velvel. We're not sure. His name was Abram. So I know about his store being almost robbed and then set on fire. I know about all the... from reading the newspaper articles, I could find the little edges. They talk about someone's plate glass window of their store being broken by a sleigh that the wind picked up and threw around or something, and they bemoan the fact that this poor storekeeper had to replace the plate glass and even list how much it cost him to replace the plate glass. But when Abram Rosenfeld's store was set on fire, they reported that thankfully the fire didn't spread to any of the other surrounding buildings, and thankfully there was no damage, although his inventory was destroyed by the water and the smoke. It's like, okay, there's a distinct difference here. So finding those things are really what gave me the topic of anti-Semitism that I wanted to present, because that title, that headline, Bobbie Rosenfeld loses 800-meter race, that's an actual headline from a Barrie newspaper. And that was the one that I read it and I just went, oh, this is just so wrong. I can't just let this go. So the sources of the research really guided the creation of the play. I also have family who's been in this area, both sides. My mom's and my dad's have been in this area for a long time. And my grandfather worked in the press room of the Barrie Examiner, and my dad worked in the press room and the typesetting room of the Barrie Examiner. So while doing this research, I came to terms with my own potential generational biases and my own questions about how did my ancestors treat the Jewish community in Barrie. Because I grew up in Barrie and had no idea there was a Jewish community in Barrie. I had no idea. I'd never heard Bobbie Rosenfeld's name until I was an adult. I didn't know anything about Jewish culture until I went away to university. So either my family didn't know anything about it either, or they chose not to tell me about it. So all of those things kind of came together to make me want to create what has been presented so delightfully by this cast and all the creative designers and the crew and everyone. So I'm very grateful that they helped to bring all of those thoughts of mine together into this show.
Thank you so much, Trudee. Are you guys ready to ask some questions? Some burning questions? We are very happy to open it up to the floor for you, and we will come over with a mic so that you don't have to get screaming and shouting unless you're really excited. With that said, does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask anyone on our panel here today? I'm coming.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for that wonderful production. It was just very thought-provoking. And my name is Tracy, and as one who had never known anything about her or what she has accomplished, and I'm sure there are many, because people that I said or told I was coming to see this play said, "Oh, who's that?" I am curious about whether she maintained, and you may have answered this, so forgive me, whether she maintained any strong connections or links here in Barrie, given that her huge fame and success really happened after she left and went to Toronto. And it feels like she was that stellar athlete from Toronto. And so I'm just curious what her lasting connections may have been here. And certainly I wouldn't blame her if she didn't want to have any, based on how they were treated. Thank you.
Okay. I can tell you that she did maintain friendships in Barrie after she moved to Toronto. She had friends here that she would sometimes come up and visit, because I found articles about parties and things like that. It was shortly before she passed away. It was probably 1960, somewhere between 1965 and 67. She was given the honor of being, what was the title? I can't remember the title, so I'm just going to say the head of Barrie's Winter Carnival here in Barrie in February. And so they had a nice dinner for her, and they celebrated all of her successes, both as an athlete and a journalist. And all of her friends from Barrie attended the dinner, and some other people from out of town. I can't remember who now, but there were a few people. I think one of the other Matchless Six, one of the other Canadian women's Olympic athletes, attended as well and spoke about her. I don't know, maybe it was Alexandrine, I'm not sure. Yeah, so that was a big deal. And that was sort of the one thing that I did find in the newspapers that was honoring her. And then, of course, in 1985, she was the first inductee into Barrie Sports Hall of Fame. So athletes in Barrie tend to know who she is a little better than the general population. But yeah, you were certainly not alone in not having known who she was. Yeah. The Matchless Six. So that's the name that was given to the 6 women on the track and field team. Yeah.
If I can just add a little anecdote, because it sort of connects to Rochelle's story about Morris in the picture frame and rescuing him. I had the honor of interviewing Ethel while I was doing research for the book. And we had a really interesting, wonderful conversation. And then on her, I forget, a buffet or so on, I saw a framed photograph of Max, Sarah, Morris, and Bobbie. And I'd never seen this photograph before, so I asked Ethel, please, can I borrow it? I'll just take it to a local photographer. I'll bring it back in 2 hours. And at first she said, no, I won't lend that to you, because somebody from some newspaper had interviewed me, taken all my scrapbook, all my newspaper clippings and never returned it. So obviously she wasn't sure if she could trust me. Like, who was I? I was coming out of the woodwork. Anyway, I begged and pleaded with her and finally managed to persuade her. Rochelle, if you can just hold my book for a minute. So I've got this here. And I'm willing to hand this around if you promise you'll give it back. So this is the photograph. This was taken in Russia before they left, just before they left. And I have a photograph of the back of it, which proves that it was taken in Russia because I can't read it. Anyway, it's a treasure for me. And Teddy, I don't know, maybe people want to look at it, but please be very careful with it. So it just, sometimes when we're doing research for a book, we find these jewels, these hidden gems, and they really are treasures. And one more thing I should say is, recently, because of the play and because of what Rochelle and Trudee and Bruce have done, I'm discovering new things about Bobbie. This is like 20 years later. So the story continues. Like, it's not over, and it does my heart so much good.
Two things. First of all, I'm very relieved to hear you say that this was Ethel's approach, because she's always blamed my mother for losing all of the things that Bobbie had. So it was a pleasure to hear that. But it really was an issue that people borrowed things and then they didn't give them back. And there was a scrapbook that apparently my mother lent to somebody that totally disappeared. And my poor mother never lived that down. But I did want to tell you something that many people don't know. Maybe nobody else here does but me, but that is going to change momentarily. One of the things that happened is that after the 800 meters, Bobbie received a letter from the mayor of Penetang, that's where Jean Thompson lived, and she had it framed and kept it in her home for all of her life, and most people don't know that. Thanking her for her sports-like support, and really saying, what it meant to the people who supported Jean, that Bobbie also supported Jean.
Did you want to say something else?
And it's easy to get carried away about Bobbie's story. And one more thing, Bobbie wrote for a column for the Globe and Mail. It was first called Feminine Sports Reel, and then the name was changed to Sports Reel. So she wrote that for about 20 years. And if I'm not mistaken, Bruce, Alex Gibb wrote an article, like a sports article in Montreal, like similar, about women's sports. So thanks, Teddy. So both of them were so passionate about spreading the story, the importance of women's sports. And we're talking the 30s, 40s into the 50s, where women's sports were really put on the lowest rung, after men's amateur sports, after men's professional sports. Women's sports were almost an afterthought, I think, in those decades.
I know there are other questions, but just let me add very briefly to what Anne has said. Alex Gibb had a daily sports column in the Toronto Star, and she also wrote general news and politics from time to time. And Myrtle Cook, who moved to Montreal, wrote a daily sports column for the Montreal Herald for many years. So this was a generation that sought not only to excel at sports, but promote their own sports. And as a result, during the interwar period, they had more visibility for women's sport than has happened until very recently. History doesn't go in a straight line. The sad thing is that these amazing first wave feminist achievements in sport were reversed in the very conservative aftermath of the Second World War.
I don't know if you saw the picture closely when it went around, but what I love about that picture, which I hadn't seen until recently, Anne and I did a presentation together, is that Bobbie is an infant, but both her feet are visible in the picture, and she's holding on to one of them. And I just think, even as a baby, her feet were so important. And to the topic of learning things, continuing to learn things, it was about a month before the show began that I figured out, with the help of Mary Harris, another historian here in town, that I knew that the Rosenfelds had lived at 21 Collier Street in Barrie, that's where their store had been. But I figured out then that the building that is currently at 21 Collier Street is the same actual building that they lived in. That building has been there since 1890. Now it's about to be torn down because there's a developer who's building some condos called the Grand Opera Tower. So we heard that, Mary Harris and I, and we went, okay, so he's naming it that because the Barrie Opera House used to be there. This is good. He cares about the history. So I managed to contact him and explained that who Bobbie Rosenfeld was, because he didn't know either, and that the Rosenfeld family had lived in that building, which is part of the land that he's going to build the opera tower on. He was thrilled to hear that. He allowed the cast in costume to go to that home, so Khalil and the rest of the Theatre by the Bay team were able to take some photos of the cast in front of that building, which is just so neat. And when the condo tower is built, he has taken it under advisement, and it seems like he will be putting a plaque in there to commemorate that Bobbie lived there. So really happy about that. I will do that. That's an excellent suggestion, Linda. Yeah, good idea. This is another historian who knows of what she speaks. Oh, she said that we should give the developer one of Anne's books so that it keeps it front of mind, and once he reads about her, maybe he'll want to do even more than just a little plaque. So, yeah. Thanks for asking.
Thank you all so much for sharing those stories. I believe we have a question over here, so I'm just going to pass the mic over.
Thank you. I, like others, really appreciated the play. I did know something about Bobbie Rosenfeld, but it's always good to see more history and more about a really significant woman in Canadian sport history. I'd like to turn the conversation to the topic of anti-Semitism, because I think that her place in history is significant because of being a Jewish immigrant. Not just an immigrant, but specifically a Jewish immigrant, and the anti-Semitism that the family faced here was profound then. And I just wondered to what extent you feel that her intervention on the whole issue of anti-Semitism and being wanting to be treated as a regular person like everyone else either transformed the landscape around anti-Semitism in Canada, or if, as her father repeatedly pointed out, we'll get through this, it comes and it goes, and we can live through this. So I'm just curious, given the range of backgrounds that everybody has, both about Bobbie and about sport, what you think, if anything, is different today.
That last one's a kicker. Because even in the space of the 2 years that I've been creating this play, anti-Semitism has gone through another rise, never totally goes away. I understand part of it is tied to the pandemic and all of the things that people bring up when they're hurting and that kind of thing. In terms of Bobbie's impact, I don't think I am the person to speak to that, so I will pass this along to
That's a great question and very hard to measure. She certainly did have an impact upon Canadian sport, and the equation that she presented, if you admire me, you've got to admire me as a Jewish woman athlete. I think that was understood, as I understand it, by many in the amateur sports establishment in the 1920s and the 1930s. There was the chef de mission of the Canadian team in Amsterdam in 1928 refused to go along with the protest of the decision and to challenge the judge overruling the finishing judges, and that's a true story. It was not only Bobbie and Alex Gibb who got criticized, but it was but it became a cause célèbre in Canada, and the head of the Canadian delegation who basically called off the protest was a man by the name of Arthur Lamb. At the subsequent annual general meeting of the Amateur Athletic Union in Port Arthur 4 months later, Lamb was widely condemned for his lack of support for Bobbie Rosenfeld. Widely condemned. And as a result, his attempt to win re-election as president of the AAU was defeated. And in the interwar period, he was the only one-term, one-year AAU president. So whether it was Canadian nationalism that objected to the decision, or whether it was support for Bobbie and the unfair treatment and this refusal to protest, that decision had tremendous reverberations within Canada after the Games.
Rochelle, do you want to tell that story you told at the night about Fanny Bobbie being invited to?
Yeah, okay. I was thinking about things that I don't know really, I wasn't around then, a lot about Bobbie's influence at the time, but I did know Bobbie. And she took her position as a Jew and as a woman very seriously. She realized that she was somebody who was out there, and her public image was, it sounds funny to say it was very important to her, but it actually was very important to her. Bobbie was very funny, soft, loved Lokshin-Kugel, and she was a really warm and loving aunt. That's the Bobbie of the private Bobbie. The public Bobbie was one tough cookie, and she knew that she was a representative. So she had funny kind of anti-Semitism, which is, Jews aren't allowed, but she had another one where they said, well, Jews aren't allowed, but we want you. And that's really, that's where she had to stand up and say, sorry, Jews aren't allowed. I'm a Jew. I am not gracing your establishment. I am not joining your golf club. I am walking away from that because of anti-Semitism. So she did have to do that. I wish I could tell you that it stamped everything out and we're all okay about it. But what's encouraging to me is being involved in the Bobbie Rosenfeld Day and in the opening of the play, and hearing the mayor of Barrie talk about anti-Semitism and talk about this is something that we really have to recognize, and not because somebody Jewish has pushed that, and maybe with the play as well, but because somebody is looking at that and saying, this isn't right. It's not just coming from Jews saying this isn't right. And I think that's one thing that it really struck me as the strength in which he spoke about that on both occasions. So whether it'll make a difference, I don't know. But I think that the desire to have it make a difference is really strong.
I just just wanted to add that to Rochelle's point, there was no point that I ever heard about where Bobbie underplayed her Jewish culture. So that line where she was heading off to the Olympics and someone told her to bring home the bacon, and her saying, "What, me, bacon?" is actually what she said. So she absolutely made a point of saying, "I'm Jewish. You know I'm Jewish, right?" You know, she did not ever deny her faith, you know?
Well, you'll forgive me if some of my facts aren't accurate because it's been over 20 years since I did the research. But there were a few things I wanted to say. One is how much one person could do in the context of those times. I think it was incredible what she could do. Because in the 1930s, and we know in the 1940s, there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism in Canada. If you've read the book None is Too Many, you know how just a tiny number of Jews were allowed to escape from Europe during the rise of Nazism and during the Holocaust. So that's one thing. But sometimes I wonder how Bobbie would have felt. Firstly, I think there was a competition in the Melrose Games the following year after the Olympics, and Bobbie was running in a relay, and she actually won her section of the relay against Betty Robinson, who had won the gold at the Olympics. So I wonder how Bobbie must have felt, probably really happy and gratified. And the other connection to Barry is that in the 30s, I think 34, 35, maybe 36, I'm not sure, Rochelle, but Bobbie was coaching Irene Story-Weber, a local Canadian girl sprinter, and Red Story's daughter. And I think Irene won a race against Betty Robinson also. If I'm not mistaken, I read that recently. Yeah. Yeah. So I think Bobbie must have felt really, gratified. I don't want to quite say revenge, but bringing things around in a circle, and so wonderful that she actually did coach a girl from Barrie who did very well in running. So it's so hard to look at these events and understand the context that these people were living under. Being an immigrant kid, first generation immigrant kid, Bobbie's amazing strength and courage to do what she did. I'm astounded every day when I think about that, because a lot of Jews were trying to fit in, keep a low profile, just like Max was saying, or Sarah was saying, just like, let's not rock the boat. I mean, this was the time of quotas in the university, and a lot of Jews not allowed, like at the beach or in lots of places. So even to survive those times was amazing.
One of the things that Trudee and Anne didn't know, because they only saw black and white pictures of Bobbie, is that Bobbie later in life did not do gray. She dyed her hair red.
And I just learned that, and isn't that amazing? And if you look at her photos, you'll see how well-groomed, how polished Bobbie was, from her hair and her makeup and her clothes. I think she always felt she was representing the Jewish community. Even I have this photograph of her when she was doing something at the CNE, at the X, and she was announcing something, and she looked so fabulous. This was in the 50s. So always, I think she was aware of her public persona and aware that she was representing the Jewish community in as positive a way as she could.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for all of those very considerate answers. It's been such a joy being able to talk to all of the lovely people behind this project. Being considerate of everyone's time, we're looking to wrap things up, but it's been a treat getting to talk with all of you as well, and we encourage you to take this as an opportunity to continue these conversations outside of this theater. This production has been so much more than just a very special play about a very special lady in Barrie. And we encourage you to keep asking questions and keep being curious, and go Barrie and go Bobbie. Thank you so
Thanks
much
so much,
for joining
everybody.
us.
And if you're interested to hear more about the cast and creative process, we have another talkback tomorrow as well if you want to see the show a second time, or invite people, or just come back for the talkback. You're more than welcome to. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.